Version 2. In the flickering light of the flames, I could see her face. But before I caught up with others outside the city limits, there was something that I had to do. One of them had my arm twisted up my back. Another gripped my scalp. The van stood open and 2 agents led Sarah out into the road. The body of one was pitted with holes that made me think of gaping wounds. Thick liquid oozed from some of these. And as we left the outskirts, the only sound was a siren rising and falling in the distance. The closer we came to the city center though, the noisier that our surroundings became. It was past midnight, and as I hurried up the steps and when I saw her slight figure on a bench, gazing up at the departure board, it felt for a moment as if my blood was warm again. I took a deep breath and I walked towards her. It clicked open, only it wasn't Catherine. The house that I was looking for was on the left. They were federal agents, monster hunters, and they were arresting my passenger. The figure who they were manhandling started to fight back before they were forced inside to never be seen again. They broke free, but their efforts were in vain. Sam too threw the foul thing to the ground and said, "The agents will come back and we won't have the 4 horsemen in our corner." She was slender and dressed all in black. A dress which had reached the ground, it seemed to merge with the darkness as she moved gracefully towards me. Death stepping forwards, its empty eye wells of darkness, its mouth a void from which words came. From behind his muzzle, Sam too growled, "Don't you worry about it, they'll pay for this." That bought him a blow from a baton and he crumpled to his knees. Agent Jack's a grint and said, "This is what things like you deserve, and I won't rest until every last one of you was captured or killed." From the malicious expression on his face as he said killed, it was clear which one he preferred, and I kept as still as I could. I suspected they would kill us at the slightest excuse. Sam too knew this as well, I was sure, and I could see the anger and frustration burning in his eyes. Until it flickered. "I'm in charge of this operation to clean up the city for freaks like you, and I would like us all to give a big hand to the monster who led us to your lair." A side door in one of the vans stood open and 2 agents led as Sarah out into the road. I could never have afforded to live there, and even if I could have, I wouldn't have wanted the current view from the completed apartments, which was of scaffolding and cranes. She was silent as I pulled away and I said nothing. Sarah ran over to Sam too and helped him to his feet. Lighters were being produced and flames were sparking into life. And perhaps our new futures could intertwine. There was no other traffic and no lights in the windows. But I didn't get the chance to speak. I had seen him many times before and knew that Sam too was a shapeshifter. Telling myself that I was being stupid but not able to help myself, I found a place that I could park without getting a ticket, and I went to see if she needed a hand. Her smile when I caught up with her made me forget my worries, and I walked alongside her as she navigated the stops. All of the drivers had secrets. I've been afraid for a while now that all the hate is finally going to explode into a chaos from which there will be no return. Some people would call this the end times, a period which is heralded by a bunch of signs including the appearance of 4 seriously scary dudes, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. As he did, the sound of hammering on the shutters filled the depot and a voice called from out in the street. When Sam too's familiar voice on the radio brought me out of my daze. Beyond the gate, a house that looked like it had been plucked from the pages of a Gothic novel waited. The houses that I was passing now were older and many stood in their own grounds. From the cracks in their walls and the leaves in their gutters, a good few looked like they had seen better days. A rumble of thunder followed and the clouds broke and rain began to lash down. I wound my window up and gripped the wheel a little bit tighter. But all that came out was a strangled gasp, and he fell to his knees, grasping his throat. "Yes, ma'am." When I got back to the vehicle too, Sam too was trying to call me on the radio. "Where have you been?" he growled when I answered. One of the agents took out a taser and unleashed it at close range. He called Jake on the radio and then told him to get off the streets. "I guess you found a more reliable taxi company to bring you here this time," I said with a smile. "Well, I would have called you but you didn't leave your number." I looked around at the other agents. They were shocked by what they were seeing as well. And a whole host of other agents just itching to get their hands on the likes of me. I was stunned and I asked in a shaky voice, "But you'll get better, right? One day you will be able to travel." I hoped that she hadn't set off yet on her nightly trip to the railway station and I would find her still in. The encounters with the 4 horsemen and the federal agents had made me think again about her plea for me to bite her and give her a dark life. "You have 10 seconds to exit." I turned to Sam too. I spend a lot of time when I'm at home on my own reading. There was no time to call the dispatcher and ask for help. In less than a minute, he was covered in a dense layer of hair. The shape of his face had changed as well, though the change itself had been lost to sight under the rapidly spreading hair. I could tell her that I wasn't sure and would promise that she wouldn't be charged extra if the route we took was not the shortest. His nose and mouth had extended into a snout and his fingers were long and tipped by curving, sharp nails. It was well lit and spacious. There is no point to coming clean now. I peered back at the taxi with its skeletal driver. This city is a powder keg of angry people who all blame somebody else for their problems and think that violence is the answer to it all. I picked up the passenger from a private clinic in the city center. A figure emerged from a gloomy corner of the depot. He walked unsteadily, dragging his feet across the floor, and a low moan drifted from his mouth as he moved towards us. I couldn't look at her as I sat. "I'm so sorry." I could feel her gaze still on me as she said, "Please. Just let me know when you're ready to leave." To be honest, my friend, I don't know apart from go about our business as normal and hope that the city can pull back from the brink. "That's better," he said in a gravelly voice. I was not remotely bothered by any of this. There was no way that I wanted to risk sharing this curse with anybody else. I sat on the battered armchair in the corner of my front room, bit the corner of the sachet off and drank down the bland blood substitute. He was still in his human form and his skin was drained of color. And even if they did, no one in authority would listen to them. Thick strands grew from his cheeks and his forehead and his chin. They curled up over his scalp and encircled his ears. She was slender and dressed all in black. I picked up the passenger from a private clinic in the city center. The traffic around me ebbed and flowed and I focused on the road and getting to the destination in good time, until I saw a car in my rearview mirror that made my skin crawl. Overhead, a helicopter cut through the sky. But they were ordinary people in ordinary taxis at first, I said, searching for reasons that he was wrong. Not knowing what else to do, I tried to think about what Sam too had said, about carrying on as normal and hoping that things would work out. She told me that there would be no need, that she had a taxi booked. "My name is Agent Jax." I went to sit on another bench to give her some space. Moments later, the ground beneath us began to shake and the manhole cover was rattled aside. From the angle that I was seeing the taxis, I couldn't make out the other 3 drivers in any detail. But I had the feeling their appearances would be just as chilling as their rides. Flames rippled and the trails of alcohol left, and then our would-be attackers were fleeing, slipping back into the side streets. There was only one thing that I could think to do. If I put the pedal to the metal, I could drive through the figures in front of the taxi. She shook her head and then replied, "I'm dying, but until then I can dream." I couldn't think of anything to say apart from to tell her, "I'll wait and give you a ride home." There was a sneer on his face. They wore a long coat, a fedora, and sunglasses over a layer of bandages. Most were being developed into fashionable apartment blocks, and a few were complete. He owned the company and he worked as the dispatcher. Behind me, the shutters rattled closed and then Sam too walked past, heading for his office. There was more chance of him wearing a suit and tie to work or hiring a cleaner to make the inside of the depot look less like a junkyard. He greeted me with a nod, flicked ash from his cigar onto the sidewalk, and then turned and rolled up the shutter doors which led through to the depot. His mottled, gray flesh was falling away in places its strands of tendon were exposed. A red light ahead left me waiting close by to them. One of the drivers looked at me through his rolled-down window. Nothing in sight apart from more than a dozen men with their sweatshirt hoods pulled up in scarves covering their mouths, except for one man. He was swigging from a bottle, and when he had finished, he held the bottle up and aimed it at the car. "Well, if you're sure it's not too much trouble, there's a customer who needs picking up from a bar in the corner of Turner and Grave Street." I radioed back that it wasn't a problem and I set off. When he was outside taking a cigar break and could be seen by passers-by, he was Sam 2 Stott, an out-of-shape middle-aged man. In the privacy of the depot, though, he could relax and be Sam 2 Stott, an out-of-shape beast. I broke free of her gaze. She smiled at me sadly and said, "Are you the taxi driver? I'm sorry, I should have cancelled the booking, but there's been so much to do since Catherine passed away this morning." They were in a feeding frenzy and the agent didn't stand a chance. Sam too didn't sound impressed with my excuse as he went on. "As pale as bone, I thought. Federal agents, we know that you're in there." The railway station was a grand old building in the heart of the city. Ridges formed in her pale skin. Even if I could fit in the boat, the daylight would filter through. They pulled to a halt and their drivers stepped out. I could see who they were, what they were, but for Agent Jacks and his lackeys seeing the world through their human eyes, the 4 horsemen must have just looked like ordinary taxi drivers, like middle-aged men stepping out of vehicle 2s that had seen better days. There was only one thing that I knew for sure anymore as the miles passed away. The night is the loneliest place. She was wearing a denim jacket over a dress and looked to be in her late 20s, the age that I had been when I had been bitten, and she was getting soaked in the downpour. The other agents were not trying to help. I yelled, "No, wait." I pushed my door open and I stumbled into the road where she was walking around the trunk of the car. Her movements were as graceful as before. She didn't seem panicked or afraid in any way. Seeing her, the men were jeering and calling out obscene threats. Fear pulsed through my body in confusion. I didn't understand what she thought that she was doing. There were just 4 regular vehicle 2s waiting for a fare to come along. They had short hair and despite the late hour wore wraparound sunglasses. Sam 2 radioed Jake and explained what had happened and then listened to Jake's reply. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I thought, with a bitter smile as I let myself into my building. With a bitter smile as I let myself into my building. Another short summer night would be over all too soon. She looked exhausted and we didn't speak again as I drove her back. She turned to wave goodbye before letting herself into a small house on the quiet street where we had met. "What do we do?" I asked him, hearing the desperation in my own voice. He sighed. Further down the road, smoke rose in gray tendrils from a burnt-out car. While I was waiting for Sam 2 to call me with a new job, I decided to go by the railway station and see if she was there. And then it returned to its taxi and started the engine. But it had not taken away his ability to fix anything connected with a vehicle 2. With her settling into her seat, I closed the door and climbed back in behind the wheel. There was an angry mob in hot pursuit of her at the time. A jagged line opened in the metal and then boots were kicking at it. I put my hat in my hands. I had never seen anything like this before. Her eyes grew narrower and sharper at the sides. She looked now like a twisted mix of a human and a bat, and when she opened her mouth and her rouged lips curled into her dark smile, the transformation was complete. Its hood was bone white and a skull looked out from behind the wheel through empty sockets. Spread out across the lanes alongside it, drove the other harbingers of the apocalypse. So I said goodnight and set off on the walk home. I stayed in a claustrophobic apartment in a rundown district in the city center. This was a cramped booth over by a wall. It had clear glass sides and a door that was always open because the handle was busted. They grabbed me and Sam too and hauled us outside. That didn't help me one bit, but by then first light was dangerously close and I needed to get back to my apartment and shelter in the dark. When I woke, I felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I was gasping for breath. Felt like the walls were closing in on me and I was gasping for breath. And she asked without hesitation, "Will you bite me and make me like you? I won't die then of this horrible illness. I will never die." And there was me. She had left the coastal town where she had once tempted men to their death. Thankfully, the windshield didn't seem to be damaged, though I could see fragments of glass on the hood. The hooded figures were laughing wildly now. "Is that because you're a creature of the night?" I didn't answer her question. "I'll head back to my apartment and hide up. At nightfall, I'll follow you." The diseased horseman moved its hand then towards a manhole cover in the road. Threatening but not releasing his crude missile yet, while he raised the bottle the others encircled the car. I looked back at the road and the remains of the federal agent lay unmoving near the abandoned vans. My passenger's destination was in an up-and-coming area. Old warehouses lined the streets. I hate to be late for Madame de Beau's cocktail parties. This horseman raised an arm ravaged by disease and pointed at Agent Jacks. Catherine sat on a bench and looked up at the board. I did not know where she had a ticket for and asked, "Do you have a long wait for your train?" A wistful expression settled on her face and there was sadness in her voice when she replied. But then she changed. Overhead, a helicopter cut through the sky. Its body was pale. I shook my head and whispered, "I'm sorry." They offered no explanation for their appearance and I asked no questions. I dropped them off at a house on the edge of the woods which bordered the city to the north and then set off back for the depot. And as for the horse business, nobody rides them critters anymore in built-up areas, not even agents of destruction. She replaced her veil and said in a calm voice, "Please continue as soon as you are able to, driver." Shivering, I started the engine and headed for the familiar and safe surroundings of the depot. The minute that Sam 2 set eyes on me, he knew that there was something wrong. "Taxis, not horses," I added. Sam 2 crossed his hair-covered arms over his chest and said, "You saw their true forms because Creature of the Night 2s can observe the world differently. The agents were seeing what I saw." Moments later, another object smashed against my side window. I glanced around frantically and saw hooded figures emerging from the side streets. Not yet. Give up the cigars for his health, but I knew that it was never going to happen. My passenger Catherine was gazing up at the impressive facade of the station and I was glad to see that there was a smile on her face. I had never seen anything like this before. Agents such as these hunted in packs and there would be more vans nearby. A doorman in the uniform welcomed her inside. I was still parked up, my mind racing at my unexpected and confusing encounter with a young woman who had been dealt a tragic hand by the fates. The skin on his face began to bubble and blister and then boils began to appear through the opening that they had made. Sam 2 sighed like a man who had just loosened his belt and sat back in his chair. She stood tall and proud and then she lifted her veil. They had seen me and known what I was and followed me back to the depot. I couldn't just ignore her, so I reached over and rolled the window down. I figured the four horsemen had revealed their true faces to everybody gathered there. No doubt they were growing everywhere else beneath his clothes. "In your weakened state, I do not believe that you would survive." Chilling as their rides. But when I arrived at the address for the pickup, my hideous night got even worse. A van with no markings was parked outside the bar and a figure was being bundled roughly into it by three men wearing dark suits, white shirts, and plain ties. They were huge and fiery. They were all over his face and they were in his eyes and in his mouth when he opened it to scream. The body of another of the taxis was sunken in at the sides as if somehow it was emaciated. I could see that she had been crying. Her nose widened and flattened against her face. When I arrived, 30 minutes or so later, Sam 2 was standing in the street outside the depot smoking his cigar on his break. He was there now, cutting the muzzle off of Sam 2 with a pair of bolt cutters. I had become a creature of the night too after being bitten by a stranger 5 years earlier, but unlike the stylish and selfish old lady, I was a struggling mess. I didn't want to be a creature of the night too. There were many shades of monsters, each with their own dreams and fears. Are you sure your passenger was okay? I looked up when Sam 2 asked me this. Yeah, she was absolutely fine. And then I wiped my hand across my face and asked her if she needed a ride home. I walked back to the taxi and drove out of the city for the last time. I didn't think that I was going to sleep, but at some point, I fell into a dreamless pit. I was in so much pain I thought I was going to lose my mind. And then the front door swung open and a woman emerged. "Got a job for you," he said. I felt a mix of guilt at my actions and relief that I had not been found out as I acknowledged the details. The agent started to lead me and Sam 2 to separate vans, but before they could throw us inside, 4 vehicle 2s drove slowly up the road. The agent cried out, but his pleas for help were lost beneath the squeals of the rats. Sam 2 grunted at my answer and scratched vigorously behind one of his hairy ears. I accelerated, almost crashing into oncoming traffic. With our plan agreed, I climbed back into my vehicle 2 and raced through the back streets, where there were no CCTV cameras that could give me away to the feds. The following night, I was back at work as always. He slumped into the high-backed leather chair by the desk. Bottles were dropped and broke harmlessly in the street. Recoiled in horror. The agents yelped and tried to shake and push the rats off, but more rats had appeared from another open manhole cover and the agents were being overwhelmed. He growled and then called out, "Hey Dan, I got a job for you." There were glints of bone, the sickly sweet odor of decay. The drivers joked to his face that this was because he liked the sound of his own voice. Sam 2 was in his 50s and always wore a white vest and decrumpled tan slacks held up by braces. I hated the thought that we were being driven out by hate, but I knew that Sam 2 was right. This was about survival now. As the last of the longtails slipped away from view, Death said, "We are not needed in this city." Things had happened so quickly that I couldn't be sure, but I thought it was a bottle that had struck the car. The radio enhancer that Sam 2 used to contact the driver sat center stage on a desk that was overflowing with paperwork and plastic coffee cups. "Seriously though, it is good to see you again and have some company." I shook my head and replied, "I'm sorry, but no." She looked upset at my answer and took a deep breath before asking, "Can you take me anyway please?" She was shaking by now in the delusion and I noticed that she was using a walking stick to support her weight. I could tell that there was no need from the way that she was looking at me. In some ways, I was like the lady who I had driven earlier that night. Hair appeared on his shoulders and along the length of his neck, and on his hands and his arms. He looked like he had been stocky once, but his muscles had turned to flab around the time that he had gone bald, and he was constantly wiping sweat from his face with a handkerchief in the unrelenting heat. A part of me thought Sam 2 should give up the cigars for his health, but I knew that it was never going to happen. There was Sarah and she was a siren. There was Jake, he was a lycanthrope. Even more so when she hopped with ease up onto the trunk and then up onto the roof of the taxi. The sky was thick with dark and threatening clouds and it was not long before a bolt of lightning split the gloom. She was clearly vulnerable and alone, but she was not one of the strange. She was an ordinary person, and if I gave her a ride in my vehicle too, I would be breaking the company's rules. I rubbed my eyes, looked again, and the forgettable face of a middle-aged man had disappeared. I was staring at his skull. Night had returned and I could leave. I had never fed on a living person since being made a creature of the night too, and I never would. He had told me that he had learned at a very early age to hide his animal side from ordinary people, and that would always have to be the case. Something came hurtling through the air and smashed against the windshield. I slammed the brakes on instinctively. The last of the 4 was the most unsettling of all. He wasn't alone in the taxi company and being strange and wanting to keep his differences private. Trying not to think about them, I followed my friends into the depot. Dan must have hidden when the raid had started. "There is evil here, Death," said Agent Jax, gulped in a breath and said in what I guessed he hoped was the voice of authority, "That is right, and we are here to take the evil off the streets." Death turned its gaze towards him and said, "You are the evil here," and then it turned to the horseman, whose vehicle too was pitted with wounds. Hardwood benches sat on a marble floor under a vaulted ceiling. "That won't work for me," I replied. Arched windows stood tall in a stone facade that was decorated with gargoyles. There were no lights visible and no signs of life, and I wondered for a moment if the dispatcher had made a rare mistake and sent me to the wrong address. By the time that Dan had made the windshield safe, it would be too close to dawn for me to go out and risk picking up any more fares. I felt no pity for either of them, just an overwhelming sense of sadness at the prejudice which fueled the monster hunter's actions. Now she had changed her ways. I had decided that if she was willing to take the risk, that I would be on her side every step of the way during the transformation. In the novels that I read, Creature of the Night 2s don't cast shadows. And when you walked towards me just then, you didn't cast a shadow. I was undead, but I wasn't heartless. The light had changed and there was a short-tempered queue behind me. I rode forwards and then pulled over as soon as I could. Emerged. One of them stepped forward. I sighed. She looked at Sam too and me and said in a weak voice, "I'm so sorry they made me tell him everything." The depot was a large open space. I swerved out of the way, two of my wheels mounted the sidewalk and I weaved across lanes, glancing frantically back to see if the four horsemen were still on my tail. Through their windshields, I could see the eyes of those who would bring war and famine and plague, glowing darkly in faces that had been forged long ago. There were no more customers booked in yet, so I was parked up on a quiet street waiting for Sam 2 to call me. The heat was more oppressive than ever, but a storm was building. I closed my front door behind me, made sure that all the locks were bolted, and then went to get a sachet of plasma from the fridge. Despite this, it looked like my shift was over. "Get out of here, this is federal business," Agent Jack said. She saw me approaching and her smile eased my nerves. She knew my dark nature. They clearly wanted to commit robbery. I'm worried that something has happened to her. I was a few minutes away from the depot when I noticed 4 taxis parked by the side of the road. I had not seen a taxi vehicle too stand there before. Sadness enveloped me. There was no point explaining that I wasn't from the taxi company that Catherine had used to take her to the railway station. It was over for us. One of them tripped in the chaos and seconds later were covered in rats. I could make out their fangs as they bit. A steep set of stone steps led from the sidewalk up to the concourse, and as she began to ascend them, I could see that she was struggling. I turned away from this hideous spectacle. Her face was bruised and caught. She said in a quiet voice, "Thank you." He worked 7 nights a week except when it was the full moon and he took time off from driving and he locked himself in a cage until the dawn came. Driving and he locked himself in a cage until the dawn came. I didn't have the strength to struggle as they dragged me into the middle of the road. Only she was opening her door and stepping out of the car. He was outnumbered though, and I watched helplessly as the agents put a muzzle on him, handcuffed him and began to kick and punch him. There were more agents out in the road and vans parked at angles. Every exposed edge could have been a blade made for killing. He had changed into the beast and was clawing at the agents and trying to bite chunks out of them. There was no sight of them though, and I began to breathe a little easier, until it occurred to me that there was no way that I could escape them. He was middle-aged, had short dark hair, a cigarette hanging from his lips, a forgettable face. The hooded figures recoiled in horror. "Message me and let me know where you're at." I doubted that I would ever see Catherine again, and I definitely would never drive her in my vehicle too. We all wanted to avoid our existence becoming known by ordinary people because of the inevitable persecution which would follow. To help ensure this, Sam 2's taxi company operated by word of mouth and our only passengers were the strange. Most of the local services had ended for the day, but there were cross-country services scheduled to depart all through the night. The creature of the night two's fangs glistened as it cried out into the night. I told her, "It's on the house." A fleshless hand reached up to take the cigarette out of its lipless mouth and it exhaled smoke. They turned and ran. I said this out of guilt, not kindness. Men with a jolt of horror, I knew that they were looking at me. "I reckon you'll be fine come what may." I looked up. They would eventually catch up with me. The pickup address for this customer was on the outskirts of the city, and that suited me just fine. The August heat was making the city center a pressure cooker, and as the buildings thinned out, I started to relax and enjoy the drive. I rolled my window down. There was no breeze, so the open window didn't ease the heat in the vehicle too, but it was good to feel the night air on my skin. None of Sam 2's drivers mixed with regular taxi drivers, and the city was large enough for us to keep our distance as we went about our business. As I made it to my street, there were two people standing there, screaming abuse at each other. "There was something that I had to do," I replied. Though, if I didn't try and escape, the consequences for me and my passenger, I didn't bear thinking about. I could hear the unease in his voice as well when he said, "Sarah didn't arrive to pick her fare up and I can't get her on the radio." A new night saw me once more behind the wheel of the vehicle too. It creaked in protest and Sam 2 wiped a sweat from his forehead as hairs began to sprout from his skin. "We don't just pick up anybody." She laughed at this and said, "I won't be offended." I was hoping that the taxi wouldn't leak, when I heard a tapping on the passenger side window. There was a woman standing just outside. "What the?" he muttered. The figure screamed out in agony and fell to their knees. I ran into my apartment as the first light of the new day was banishing the dark. I forced myself to drink plasma to keep my strength up, and then sat with my back against a wall, my knees hugged in my face. I worked for a small independent taxi company that operated the old-fashioned way. Death's cold, knowing gaze was on me as well, burning into me, judging me. I had to get away. For regular drivers. I knew who they were straight away. It no longer looked like an ordinary vehicle too. I snapped out of the daze that her appearance had put me in, got out of the taxi and went around to the back door to hold it open for her. My taxi was 10 years old and there were patches of rust among the paint while I was wearing clothes that I had bought from a bargain store, but I still tried to offer a classy service and good manners, and a courteous smile costed nothing. They were too busy saving their own necks. Within minutes, they had all fled and the Horseman was directing the rats to return to the sewer. I could see now that there were fine cracks in the windshield and that they would need to be fixed. As I set off back for the depot, I explained to the dispatcher what had happened. There was no escape from the stifling heat and no escape from the worries which pressed down on me. I could tell that Sam 2 wanted to light a cigar, but with all the petrol and grease in the depot that was never a good idea, so he paced up and down as he spoke. "I think I know who Skullmug was," he growled, "and who his pals were. It wasn't just Sam 2 and us drivers who wanted to keep our differences private." I slowed and pulled up in front of a high, ornate metal gate. A blade screamed as it began to cut through the shutter. I couldn't see Dan and I hoped that he would be able to slip away through the fire exit at the rear of the depot before the agents swept the place. She was young and beautiful. I told Sam 2 about the agents. He raised his hands to his face and swore and then hurried over to his office. A torrent of rats appeared. They scurried towards the agents and ran over their feet and scrambled over each other to climb up the agents' legs. Music boomed from other cars. "We have to get out of the city." She was gone and there was nothing that I could do, nothing that I could say apart from, "That's okay, sorry for your loss." Our customers usually did as well. It was an older lady who resembled her. He looked lost and scared and the agents didn't give us a second chance to come out voluntarily. Must be new, I figured. I thought that I was saying things. The transformation after I was bitten was hideous. Its grotesque kin did the same, and the four drove away, leaving me, Sam 2 and Sarah on the road. I was barely holding it together because of everything that had happened, but I made it to the depot and I parked up inside. Sam 2 lowered the shutter and turned to me. "Better get Dan to look at your windshield then." The customers phoned the office to order a vehicle too, and the dispatcher called me over the radio to give me the details that I needed for the journey. From the frequent wail of their sirens, an emergency vehicle sped past nearby every few minutes. I stood there trying to catch my breath, and the creature of the night too was a woman once again, young and beautiful and with a relaxed smile now on her face when she held out her hand to me. I gave her my hand and she climbed down easily. She smiled hopefully and said, "Are you the vehicle too that I ordered to take me to the railway station? My name is Catherine Jones." I drove on. Not really. If they wanted to destroy me, it didn't matter how fast I drove. They were going to hurl the flaming bottles at us in any minute, I realized, and I felt bile rise up in my throat. The lady, though, remained a beacon of calm from her position on top of the vehicle too. I described the four taxis and the skeletal driver that I had seen, and how at first there had been nothing weird about them. It was sleek and so sharp. My confusion spiraled as I saw the other taxis, and the quartet now looked disturbingly different. He had a vile smile on his face, and I would have not been surprised to see him leave a trail of slime. Sam too was trying to put up a fight. He had changed into the beast and was clawing at the agents and trying to bite chunks out of them. The four ominous figures that I had seen. The way that I had betrayed Sam 2's trust, and Catherine. She paused for a moment and looked me in the eye before continuing. Cars. I radioed the office and explained that I had cleared this job, but I needed to come back to the depot early. A second ravaged corpse knelt nearby. The rats had devoured the boils and the pus and the flesh, and this was all that was left of Agent Jax. I'm too sick to catch a train, but I've come here tonight to look at the places that I could go if things were different. I want to dream of the life that could have been, of the experiences I could have had in places that exist to me, only as names on a departure board. A short while later, Catherine rose slowly to her feet and I went back over to her. His flesh had torn away. He came back out of his office and told us, "Jake's going to come and get us in his taxi and we're going to drive off into the sunrise." It was an appalling choice, but I could still see no other way. I span around to face the lady and I began to say, "Hold on." My new passenger nodded politely at me as she got into the car, and I thought that I could see a smile on, rouged lips through the black lace veil which covered her face. It flowed from the brim of a small hat which I imagined had been the height of fashion 200 years ago. I hated them and hated myself because I thought that this was all my fault. And dark-suited agents were streaming in through the opening that they had made. They grabbed me and Sam too and hauled us outside. The interior of the railway station was equally impressive. I was diagnosed with a serious illness last year. "Let's get this thing off you," she said and led him back into the depot. Through her lace glove I could feel how soft her hand was and how cold it was. "Sure, hop in," I said, and I hoped that I wouldn't regret my actions later. He sat me down and asked me what it was. "I can't bite you, Catherine." She looked back at me and held out money for the fare. I dropped her off outside one of the newly built apartments. Words which made me feel even worse as I thought how I had been anything but honest with Sam too by not telling him about Catherine. When I got home, I felt sick and I had no appetite for plasma. As I got up to leave, Sam too patted me on the shoulder and said, "Don't worry about it, you're a good kid, hardworking and honest." If a passenger wished to have a conversation, I was happy to chat, but otherwise I kept my thoughts to myself. I work for a very exclusive taxi service. Maybe we could spend our nights side by side. My nerves were dancing as somebody approached the door from inside. After this, she had chosen a quieter life in the city, driving a vehicle too. She did sometimes sing in seedy vehicle 2 arid clubs to tempt men into her embrace, though that was no longer a fatal experience for them. A large departure board dominated the wall above the entrances to the platforms. Despite the late hour, there were still a number of people waiting for trains. At first and then he looked confused. I had almost stopped shaking, but when Sam 2 said this, I felt a fresh wave of panic. I took a right onto a tree-lined avenue. Fixing a windshield should be a breeze. I badly wanted to see her again. I like horror the best, and Creature of the Night 2s are my favorites. Dan never left the depot, and Sam 2 had a discreet deal with a local butcher to supply animal brains to our resident mechanic. Becoming a zombie had given Dan a constant craving for brains and reduced him to a shambling, moaning, rotting state. I burnt up with a fever. I curled up in bed and I closed my eyes. I was still staring, trying to understand what I was seeing, when a horn had sounded behind me. I rolled the taxi inside and I killed the engine. I scrambled to my feet. And those punks won't talk about what they saw. Surveillance cameras turned on the scene. It was quiet when I pulled up outside a short while later. The rain had eased as well into a gentle and drifting mess. I managed to reply and I opened the door for her. The rest of the short drive to her destination passed without incident. They had more bottles in their hands and these had cloth draped in them. The street signs still needed updating as well, and I couldn't use my mobile to check because I had no signal. I thought that I was on the right road, but I was starting to have my doubts when my passenger asked, "Are you lost, driver?" There was no point in bluffing, I decided. It was midnight and I was on my way to pick up a fare. But I would hurt them badly when I struck them, maybe even kill them. My windshield was as good as new and I had dropped my first fare off. Though they were not resisting anymore, another one of the agents took out a baton and inflicted a sickening blow across the back of its head. I was distraught and I wanted to intervene, but I knew that there was nothing I could do. She placed a gloved hand on the gate, opened it inwards, and stepped out into the street. The money from all fares was shared between the drivers and Sam 2, and keeping all the proceeds from this journey would have made me feel even worse, and there was no way that I could ever tell Sam 2 about it. "That's really kind of you," Catherine said, and started to get out of the vehicle too. I retched until my guts were empty. Bottles were dropped and broke harmlessly in the street. They were both grinning. I drove to the quiet street where I had met Catherine and I knocked on her door. I walked away feeling like I had betrayed her as well now, feeling like I was absolute dirt. The only thing that I could do for Catherine was make sure that she got home okay, and that felt more important than anything else at that moment in time. I could only hope that Sam 2 wasn't trying to call me on the radio with a new booking, but if he was, I would have to make up a reason that I hadn't answered.